Hello everyone, this is Professor Wiggin, and today I'm going to walk through steps 1 through 10 with you guys on assignment A06, Framing Context for DC2. Alright, so you'll notice when we first look at the assignment, the very first step is asking you to rebuild Model 1 digitally in Rhino from your studio assignment 2A, the wood framing exercise. You'll then repeat this module X amount of times to create a structure anywhere between 16 feet and 32 feet long. Think about your site selection from step 2 when considering the length of the building that you want to replicate this module along. You'll need to create framed openings for at least 2 entrances to your structure and 6 fenestrations, such as doors or windows. For your reference, this is the studio assignment that we are referencing in A06. Model 1 is the platform framing 2-story module. Alright, so once you've modeled that in Rhino, it should look something like this. Now, I've chosen to duplicate the module twice into a 16-foot long building in the short direction. So this is a small structure. I have my 2 fenestrations for my doorways, for my entrances. In yours, you would need to add some more openings for either windows, skylights, etc. In step 2, it's asking you to select a dynamic landscape, not a city. You want an area with topography change for your model, and we're going to do that using Google Maps. You'll use the terrain view to turn the topography lines on, take a screenshot, and load the image into Rhino using the picture command. You'll then scale your picture to ensure that the shortest edge is at least 500 foot in length. You want to be sure that your ground area is large enough that it shows up well in our camera views later on. So let's do this in Google together. I'm going to go into Google Maps, and what I've searched is Crystal Lake in Montana. So if we're starting from scratch, you can type any place, open it in Maps, go to the menu option, and be sure to enable terrain view. Zoom out to make sure that it's showing the topographic lines for the area that you're searching. You want to search some location that has a noticeable topography change. If you're doing a flat area, like a desert or salt bed or something that doesn't have a lot of change, you might want to consider selecting a different location. In some cases, you might be able to manipulate it enough to make the elevation noticeable. I'm going to minimize this side panel in Google. I'm going to scroll till I actually find the lake. And then I'm just going to save a screenshot of this region. You want to be sure you're zoomed in to a point that you can clearly see the topo lines on the map. You can do a full print screen, or you can use a snipping tool like I am here to create a rectangular capture of your map view. Then I'm going to save this to my computer. Once you've saved your file, I'm going to turn off my framing model in Rhino and lock the layer since I don't need it at the moment. You'll notice I've made some layers for myself already. I have a topo map layer, which is what we want active right now, a topo lines layer, a topo surface, and a final topo lines layer. So with the topo map layer enabled, we're going to go ahead and bring in that picture that we just took from Google Maps. So I'm going to type picture, find where I saved it, Crystal Lake topo map, and hit open. I'm going to start mine at the origin. And I'm just going to click anywhere to bring it into Rhino. Now that it's in Rhino and on my correct map layer, I'm going to select my image and scale it. I'm going to click my base point near the origin, my shorter edge, and scale this to 500 feet. Before you do this, double check that your file is set to feet for your model units. So now that I have it 500 in the short direction, this is going to be a good place to start for the approximate size that I need for placing my framing model within this context. Now, we're not getting too particular about modeling this to scale or anything. We're just using these locations from Google as a basis point to build our own topography. So don't worry too much about the exact elevation height change between topo lines and the exact scale of this mountain range, for example. All right, I'm going to go ahead and activate my topo lines layer. This will be the line layer that I start to trace my topographic lines from. The next step of the assignment asks us to do just that, trace at least 15 topo lines in Rhino, position the lines at different heights in the Z direction to add changes in elevation between each line. I'm going to lock my map layer so I don't accidentally select it and move it around as I'm drawing my topographic lines. With my topo lines layer active, I'm going to start drawing. I'm going to use the interpolate points curve. And I'm going to start by first outlining the overall region that I want. So I'm going to just start clicking, and I'm going to follow the outer ridge of this hill. I'm just kind of loosely following it. So I'm going to continue around this to give myself an overall area that I'm going to deal with for my topographic map. Again, we're using this as a reference. You can be very accurate with it, but it does not have to be exact. Once I get closer to my start point, I'll hit C enter to close my curve. And here is my first topo line. Now I'm going to draw another one, and this time I'm going to follow this mountain. Now that I have this first outline of this mountain, you'll see that the rest of the lines are going to be fairly similar as I move up this. There is some nuance, but I can do this a little quicker by offsetting the curve. I'm going to type offset, click the last curve I drew, and I want to set this distance to something reasonable. I'm going to do 15 feet for now. You can see a preview of that. And you can tell it's going to overlap slightly down there, so I might try 10. That's good. Now I'll need to draw one myself again, since I'm getting kind of tight there. I'm going to start on the inside of that. And now I'm going to offset again. Clicking that last line. Now I'll go ahead and up it to 15 feet. Do that again. Again. And I'm going to finish out this last curve for the very top by hand. All right. Now I'm also going to give myself some topographic lines for this valley here. So I'll start with a new curve. I'm being careful to keep this outline at this lower elevation, right? So I can move these to the right location in my z-axis. I can go ahead and offset a few of those. Draw one more in here. All right. Very lastly, I'm going to give myself a couple on this ridge here. And we'll see how I'm doing. I'm going to offset that a couple times. Change mine to maybe 10. There we go. I'm going to hide my map momentarily and just select all of those to see what I'm at. So I'm at 14 curves there, so I'm really close. The assignment asks for at least 15. And 15 is a good benchmark. It's going to give you a good dynamic range of topography. I'm going to add one more that's just offset pretty far around this very first one that I did to give myself a bit of a border. So I'm going to click that first line, type offset, and I'm going to offset to 40 feet. All right. So now I'm at my 15 lines. If I select all those, I'm at the minimum of 15. Now what I need to do is start pushing and pulling these in the z direction. All right. So I'm going to have my perspective view open here to help me see what I'm doing. I'm going to leave my map on so I can see what should be higher and what should be lower. And I can also look at these front and right side views to help me see what's happening in the z direction. So the first thing to do that's helpful is pick a point that you're going to treat as 0, 0, and then everything else will either go above that or below that. So what line are you going to leave at 0, 0? In this one, it makes sense to pick this line here that I've started as my overall. So all these ridges are going to be lifted above that, and this valley is going to be lifted below that. I'm going to give myself one more in this valley to make it a little bit deeper. There we go. All right, so this guy and this guy, I'm going to leave at 0. So all of these I'm going to start to lift up. So this first one, I'm going to use my gumball to click on it. I'm going to start with an interval of 5 feet. So I'm lifting that one up 5. My next one would be 10. My next one will be 15. 20. 25. 30. And 35. All right, so you can already see, right, I'm starting to get the outline of that peak there. I'm going to do the same thing with this other portion that I know is raised. All right, so I can click that first line. I'll go ahead and do 5 again. Click the next one in. 10. Click my last line. 15. All right, now the last thing I need to do is my valley. So it might be easier to select from your top view to keep track of where you're at. This is my first line that should move down. I'm going to click here. I'm going to go -5 feet this time. So -5, go into the next one. -10. Into the next one. -15. Into the next one. -20. All right. And that is all of my lines. So I've adjusted all of them. I'm going to go ahead and turn off that map so I can see this. And just to make it a little easier to see for now, I'm going to change it back to black. We can already see, right, this is becoming a 3-dimensional wireframe of this landscape. I have my low points, a couple high points, and I also have this datum, this wider border for what's flat, so to say. I'm going to put this back to white for now, so I can keep it separate from my new points layer I'm going to create. All right, so if we look back at the assignment, it then asks us to use the turn points on command for each topo curve, cell point to select those points, and then a patch to create and generate a surface. So one thing that we want to do before we do a patch surface, what we want to do now is select all of these curves, and we want to make sure our final topo lines layer is active. And if you want, you could name this final topo lines and points. This is going to have our patch surface points. So I'm going to activate that. And I've made it black and kept my original lines white so I can tell them apart easily. So now with this new layer active, my final topo lines and points, I'm going to select all of these curves that I've created and rebuild them. What this is going to do is add points, new points rebuilt all around these curves that we're then going to use to create the patch surface. So I'm going to type rebuild. The default is quite often really high. We don't need this many points for rebuilding this. I'm going to go ahead and lower this to 100 right away. The other thing we want to do is uncheck this delete input and check create new object on current layer. That's going to keep our original lines on the topo lines layer and then create new curves and points on this layer that we have active right now, the final topo lines and points. So with that selected, and let's move down to 100, I'm going to go ahead and say OK. You'll notice that it's created new black lines rebuilt through those points. So it's softening some of these sharp edges that we got from our offset command, and it's smoothing that out a bit. We can turn off our original lines now, and we'll just see these new lines. If we turn our points on now, we should see all those rebuilt points around these new curves. So selecting all those, you can see these new points. This is what we want for the patch surface. With these on, we can now activate our surface layer, type cell point. It's going to select all these points. And now we can type patch. This is going to create a surface through all these points. Now there are a few settings to consider here. We can adjust the UV spans, the sample point spacing, and the stiffness. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it as it is, set up currently, and preview it. I would also recommend saving before you run this command, just in case it crashes your computer. I should save this. We can also turn off our points line to be able to see our surface a little better. So we can play around with these settings a little bit. What's really nice about how this is working right now is my corners aren't out of control. Sometimes when you do a patch surface, it can pull it in interesting ways and create these kind of upturned corners. And that sometimes has to do with the stiffness setting and the tightness of your points along your curves. What's helping us in this case is that wider offset, that border we gave ourselves to run the patch surface through. You'll notice if I up the UV spacing, it'll increase the computation time for your computer. So if your Rhino is notorious for crashing, you might want to leave this at a lower setting. But this is my UV grid, right? And I can see if I count all these lines, it'd be 60 in each direction. So if I up this, to example, for 80 in each, it's going to up the resolution of this surface through these points. So the higher the number, the higher the fidelity to those original points that we're patching through. you can see that got a little bit tighter to those forms, right? So the higher that number, the more accurate this will be. But just be careful with your particular computer and always save before running this. You can also play around with the stiffness command. Right, so we can see that smoothed it out even more. I'm going to go back a little bit on that. I'm going to maybe keep it around like 3. So I like this. I've got some peaks and I've got my valley. This is going to be a nice landscape to place my building in. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK. Next, it's asking us to create a bounding box and then contour our new surface to create and extract accurate topography contour lines. So to do this, we're going to keep our original topography lines off. We just have our surface on at the moment. We're going to go ahead and click on it and type bounding box. This is going to create a perfect box containing our surface, and this will help us set the direction for the contour. So with this still selected, I'm going to type contour. And since I used, right, when I was lifting my original lines, I used an interval of 5 feet. I want something a little smaller than that, so I see more detailed contours breaking this down. So I'm going to give it a base point from the top and click down. This is going to be the axis and the direction in which it contours my surface. And now it's asking for a distance. Mine's currently set to 2 feet, and I'm going to leave it at that, see how it does. So this is going to create a new contour line through our surface every 2 feet. If you're not happy with that spacing, right, you can play around with this a little bit. If I don't like that, I can just delete, select my surface, and run that again with a different spacing. Select my base point, my direction. Maybe that was too tight. Maybe I want to try 2.5 feet or higher. That looks pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and keep that. While they're still selected, I'm going to go ahead and put them on their own layer as well. So I'm going to create a new layer and call this Final Contours. Right, now we have everything nicely organized in our layers. We can easily isolate these elements if we want to go back and adjust anything. If I'm done contouring, I don't need my bounding box anymore. I'll go ahead and delete it. I'm also going to lock my contour layer so I don't move them. We can take a look at how these look on the surface in our rendered view. If you're not seeing them, go to your display settings and make sure curve is on in your view if they're not showing up. So this is looking pretty nice. You can see in some spots they're conflicting with the surface a little bit and they're getting a little bit hidden. You can right click on that layer, select objects, just select all those lines, and just move them up a little bit in the Z. So I'm going to move them up 4 inches, just so that they're not right on the surface. I'm going to go ahead and lock them again. Now we can see, right, that's lifted them out a little bit. We can see them a little clearer. Now I'm going to go ahead and start to think about where I want to position my model within this landscape I've modeled, my framing model. So I'm going to turn that back on. I can see my model here. You can turn it into a group or a block, something that keeps it all together so you can move it around easily. So I've grouped mine, and I'm just going to use my gumball to start moving it and placing it in this landscape. And for now, I want to try a version where it is in the valley here. Oh, that's actually my peak there. I'll bring it back over to the valley. Maybe right in this nice little pocket here. All right, so this is a really nice lake view here. Remember, it doesn't matter so much. This isn't to scale. The lake is much bigger in real life in relationship to this house or this structure, but that's okay. We're just using the Google Maps as a starting point to create an interesting topography. If you want to be super accurate with scale and take the time to really chart it out and make it proportionally make sense to your structure, you can try to do that. But what's more important is that you have a nice variation of elevation change and ground features, similar to what we're seeing here. All right, so I can start to see how this is placing in here. It's still a little high, right? My foundation is completely out of the ground. So I'm going to lower this a bit. I might want to rotate it a little. A little higher. I like that. It's nestled in that corner there. Next thing we have to do is set up a camera to start looking at this in the landscape. And the way I like to do this is, again, with our friend, the bounding box. So I'm going to go in this view. Go ahead and switch back to ghosted for now. I'm going to click on this, type bounding box. And I'm going to just draw a line from one corner of this face to the opposite corner, which is going to give me an easy place for the midpoint. Next, I'm just going to draw another line from the midpoint of that line I just drew. And I'm going to draw it perpendicular from that surface. So it's a little hard to see on my screen at the moment, but if I start from that midpoint, you can also turn off your contours for now if they're getting in your way. But I'm pulling out from that, and you can see it's snapping, and it says on perp. And I'm just going to draw that a certain distance. Doesn't really matter right now, but just give it a little bit of space. I don't need these for reference anymore. You can delete them or put them on a different layer in case you want them back later. I'm going to delete for now. Now I'm going to go to Set Camera, place Camera and Target, and use the endpoints of the line I just created. The first endpoint out here is the camera location, and the endpoint near my model is the target. And that's going to set up my first camera view, looking at my model. When you set up a camera, the first thing you want to do is save it. So I'm going to go to Set View tab, click on the old camera icon, and save this. I've already started a camera in this file. You can call it cam1 if you want, whatever you want to name it. I'm going to say OK, and yes. Now, one of the first things I'm going to do while I'm in this view is tell it to show my camera. So set camera, show camera. And now I can actually start to move this around a bit. I can pull back a little. I can tell it I want to move my house down a little bit, sticking out of the ground in this view. With that camera selected, if I go to my properties, I can make some adjustments to this camera as well. Right now my lens length is giving me a really tight view of this. I'm going to drop this down to 30, so it pulls it back a little bit. I also want to make sure that my verticals are nice and straight, so I'm going to set this to 2-point perspective. I also want to see a little bit more of that ridge that I created in the background. So I'm going to move around a little bit. I don't need this line anymore. And in my front or right view, I can start to adjust the height of my camera a bit. So I'm just going to pull this camera back a little bit. I want to see a little bit more of the landscape. So I've adjusted this slightly, this view. I'm going to look back at this in my rendered mode. All right. So I like this. I like how it's embedded in the landscape. I'm getting a nice amount of sky that I can include from my custom sky in the background here. There's one more thing that we're going to want to look at before we export these views out of here. So we've positioned our building in the landscape, we've set up our camera, and we've made sure that our ground extends beyond the camera viewport. So we're not seeing the end of our modeled landscape anywhere. Next thing we have to do is view captured a file, 3 different PNG files, one of the building landscape together, one of just the landscape, and one of just the building. And we're going to want to make sure that all of these have a transparent background, so any manipulations and textures that we add to the background can come through our framing model perfectly without us having to do a lot of masking in Photoshop. Our shadows should be on. Adjust the sun as needed for good shadows. And then once we bring this into Photoshop, we're going to place our custom sky texture in there in this overall view. And we're going to look at some ways to add a bit of texture and context to the ground. And we're going to do that using your pen textures that you've already created, or you can create a new one specific to this project if you'd like. So let's look at these steps. All right, so one thing I'm going to have to do before I get this out of here, if we think about it, if I'm going to do a PNG that's just the ground, so with the framing model off, and the transparent background is going to let my sky come through nicely, that's going to work just fine. But when I do the other one with the ground off and just my building on, we're seeing the foundation here, which we don't see when the surface is on, right? So we need to trim that foundation so that this doesn't show up in our lower view, right? So an easy way to do that, you could try to split or Boolean difference your foundation along this curve. I'm actually just going to rebuild it a little simpler than it is currently. So I'm going to go back into a perspective view. Now I think the easiest way to do this is just to create a new representation of the foundation. I'm just going to outline this rectangle. And I'm actually going to just move it right to the underside of my structure. And then I'm going to use a command called project to project a copy of it perfectly onto our topographic surface. So I'm going to type project, and it wants us to select a surface to project onto. I'm going to select my surface, hit enter, and you'll notice it projects that rectangle perfectly on to our surface as it hits the building there. So next thing I'm going to do is ungroup this and just go ahead and delete out my foundation, because I know I don't want this showing up. So first thing I'm going to do before I group that is select these two curves and loft them. So as you can see, it's just creating a new outline of that foundation that does not extend below our surface. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. Select all these objects, and group them again. All right. So now that we've done that, now that we've trimmed our foundation, so that should be the last step you do, right? When you're sure that you like where you've placed it. If you think you might move it again, maybe don't delete that yet, right? But you can always move this, as long as you have that outline, you can always move this anywhere, project down, and create this simple expression of the foundation. So you can't change that at a separate point. But once I have that done, put my contours back on. I can go to my camera 1, set it back to rendered. And now I'm going to export my views. So the first one I'll export, I'm going to show doing the ground and building separately and then bringing those into Photoshop. I'll turn off my building model. Go to export, capture to file. I want to make sure my background is transparent. The size 11 by 17, horizontal, 300 dpi. I'll hit OK. And I want to save PNG. I'll go to my A06 ground only is what I'm going to name it. I'll save it. Now that view is successfully exported, I'm going to turn back on my framing model and turn off my ground and contour lines. So I should have just the model. One thing I don't want though is this shadow in this model. So I'm going to go ahead and for this export, tell it to turn the shadows off. I'm also going to export a view of the house structure with the shadows back on. And then this ground shadow here is going to be a bit problematic, but since I have it without the shadows, I can easily cut that out. So I'm going to file, capture, do this one more time. I'm going to call this house only with shadows. Okay. By doing that, I can bring that layer in as well. And I can select the pixels of the layer that doesn't have that ground shadow. And before I delete that, from the layer with shadows, I'm going to want to hold Alt and use my marquee or lasso tool to just remove the selection in the interior of the house. So we just wanted to delete this circular shadow that came in from the shadow layer. So if I hide my house only layer for a second and have my with shadows layer active, I can delete that ground shadow now. So now we have the house with shadows, and we also have a version of it without shadows. We can blend these together to mitigate those shadows a bit. We could do that with opacity or a blend mode, which is multiply or overlay. I'm going to use opacity at the moment to just give myself somewhere in between the full shadow version and the no shadow version. So full shadows, a little bit intense. Without shadows, it's a little flat and hard to see. So here's kind of a hybrid of both. All right. Next thing I'm going to show you guys are a couple techniques, a couple ideas for creating a cool sky texture. I'm thinking of a night sky for this. And what I'm going to show is how to blend a couple photos together and using the gradient tool and then placing some custom elements on top of it. So the first thing I'm going to do is open a new file that's the same size as the file we're working in here. So again, I'm going to go to my 17 by 11 by 300. Say OK. And a site that I really like to use that I recommend you check out is called Unsplash. Why Unsplash is so great is all of its images are freely usable. So if you click on this, it means all of them can be downloaded and used for free, commercial and non-commercial purposes, and no permission is needed. Although I do appreciate it when you credit their photographers and their artists when you use their images. So that's really cool. When you download an image from them, it gives you their Instagram handle or Twitter handle, and you can give them a shout out for using their image. This is a really great site. I use it a lot. And I'm just going to search night sky. A lot of really beautiful images come up. You can get more specific, like moon or clouds. I've already downloaded a handful of here that I'm going to show you some quick ways to merge and combine them. This is a cool one too. I haven't seen that one earlier. Okay. So when you download something, it tells you who the artist is, and you can give them a shout out on these different platforms, which is really cool. All right, so in Photoshop, I've saved a few of those images, and I'm going to bring in this night sky with stars. I'm going to up the scale a little bit so it fills my whole page. And I'm going to blend that into this dusk scene with these wispy clouds and jet trails. Make this a little bit bigger so it fits my whole page. These images come in at a really great resolution. All right, I actually want my night sky to be on top. And what I'm going to do is have it blend and merge into this dusk scene below. So to do that, with this layer active, I'm going to create a mask. So I'll click on the mask icon. And it makes a mask layer on this image. With that selected, I'm going to use my gradient tool. So you want to make sure that the mask portion of the layer is selected. Also be sure that your colors down here are set to black and white. If they aren't, you can double click on them and pull them to the corners for black and white. I'm going to start with black on top and white on the bottom. Then I'm going to go to the gradient tool, and I'm going to tell it to be black and white gradient, which is the third one from the right under basic. If you hover over it, it says black and white. I also want it to be a linear gradient, which is represented by this icon here. Linear gradient. And I want to make sure that the blend mode is set to normal. The opacity is at 100, and I don't want it to reverse right now, so I'm leaving it as it is. Then I'm going to come down to my image and pull a gradient line from the top to the bottom. And this is going to blend that into the image below it. This is actually backwards from what I want. So we can click the reverse button to have it go from white to black instead. And I'm going to do that gradient again. So now it's blending from my top image down into the bottom one. So there's a couple ways to get the desired direction that you want here. You can use reverse like I did here. You can also hit X on your keyboard and switch the colors at the bottom here. So if white is top and we leave reverse off, it should give me a similar effect. Right. So it depends which color you're starting from and going down to. So this is pretty cool how it's blending into that. That's pretty nice. I like that. I might want to do something to think about. If you want to see really quickly how your landscape is going to land on your sky here, you can always drop that ground only file in just to quickly see what you're dealing with. And you might want to just leave it in here. You can turn it on and off as you're editing your sky. I want maybe a little bit more of that horizon to come up. So I'm going to do that gradient again. I'm going to do a little shorter line this time. Maybe a little bit more. Let's see how that's looking. All right. I like that. It's just creating a bit of a haze of the horizon. See a little bit of that cloud texture coming in. So I like that for now. I'm going to go ahead and leave that. And hide this again for a second. Another thing I want to show is just another strategy for creating some white cloud texture. And what I'm going to do is create a new layer. And on that layer, I'm going to create a small, not a gradient. I'm going to create a small box using the marquee tool. And I'm going to fill that box with white for now. I'm going to edit fill. And with that layer selected still, I'm going to go to filter and noise, add noise. You add quite a bit, so you can see it's really, really pixelated. You can see a preview of that here. I've also got it on monochromatic, so it's black and white. I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to do Control T. I'm really going to blow up the scale of this. I'm going to use the marquee tool again to take another piece of this, another little square. I'm going to do Control J to just copy it out of that layer. I can go ahead and get rid of the original. I'm going to do Control T and scale that again. So I'm getting these particles really large. I'm going to hold Shift to stretch these so they start to widen a bit. Hit Enter. Now I'm going to go to Image Adjustments and invert this. And once I've inverted it, I'm going to go back into Filter again. I'm going to add a motion blur. This might give you a little bit of a headache. I'm going to go add quite a bit of a blur to it, say OK. Now with this layer select, I'm going to double click, and I'm going to use this blending layer to blend out most of the black. So I'm left with just kind of the gray and white. Say OK. I'm going to duplicate that layer with Control J. I'm going to select both of them and merge them. And what that's going to do is get rid of that blending mode. So now that black information is no longer there. It's just this white and gray left. With that, I'm going to go back into Filter one last time and do a Gaussian blur this time. Blur this again, even up that a little bit. Okay. Lower that opacity. I'm going to create a copy of this layer. And this copied layer, I'm going to bring the opacity back to 100, but change the fill opacity to 0. And I'm going to call this Cloud Glow. This original layer can be my cloud layer. I'll put the glow behind it for now. And this is set full opacity, but the fill is 0. So right now I'm not seeing anything. When I double click on this, I'm going to go into my layer style, and I'm going to add an outer glow. And maybe I want this to bring in a little bit of that pink from the sunset. So you can go into the color. You can use the color picker and pick on that original image, or you can adjust the hue bar here to get the color that you want. So I kind of like this pink. I'm going to lower that opacity way down, so it's just a bit of just a touch of it. I can also adjust the size of that spread and the range. All right, so I like that. It's just a little soft pink glow around there. I'm going to say OK. Now I might want to transform these a little more, maybe stretch them, make them a little thinner. If I want to do that, one thing I'm going to want to do is hold Shift and click on both of these and link these layers. So if I change the size of one using transformation, it's going to change them both together. I might want to stretch these a little farther even. Okay. Last thing I'm going to do with this is bring in a moon to the sky. I'm going to use the Magic Wand tool to get rid of this black. I'm going to place it behind my cloud layer. If I put on my ground, I can start to move this around in relationship to the ground plane. So I'm going to make it a bit smaller. Maybe add a little opacity. And I'm going to give it that same outer glow as my clouds. So it has a little bit of that pink haze that the sky has. It's kind of cool. All right. So I'm pretty happy with that for now. So I'm going to leave that and then go ahead and hide this layer. I'm going to go back into this layer and show really quickly a couple of techniques for mapping a texture or a couple textures onto our ground surface. So I'm going to hide my houses for the moment and just deal with the ground plane. What I'm going to do is if you have one of your pen textures already, open it in Photoshop. So I'm going to use two here. One of these is from Kelly and one is from Alex. All right, so all I'm going to do within this file, you can adjust the brightness contrast if you need. I'm going to select all the pixels. So I'm hitting Control in the preview here, or you can use the Marquee tool to select it all, or Control A. And I'm going to go to Edit, and I want to define this as a pattern. So I'm going to click Define Pattern. Pen Texture 2 is fine. I'm going to say OK. And I've already done that with pen texture 1 as well. So I'm selecting it, going to edit, and define pattern. What that's going to allow me to do in my final rendering file here is select my ground plane. And I'm going to create a new layer where I map that pattern texture on top of it. So I'm going to do a new layer, Control All. I'm just going to fill it with white for now. And on this layer, I'm going to double click to go into my layer styles. I'm going to go to pattern overlay. And you'll notice I click down under pattern. I have those options of the two JPEGs that I've created in here. Right? I'm going to start with this one. I can adjust the opacity. I'm going to leave the opacity at 100 in here and control it on the master layer outside of this menu after the fact. There's some other adjustments I can make in here. You'll notice it's tiling it across that whole layer. I can change the scale of it. I can make it smaller. I can change the angle. I like this angle here. I'm going to make the scale a little bit bigger. That's very good. So I'm going to say OK. It's thinking. So take a little bit. And I'm going to call this texture 1 active pattern. And I'm calling it that because I'm going to keep this layer as the one that I can edit the pattern if I want to change the scale or the angle. I'm going to make a copy of it, turn off my original one. I'll just keep that in this file so that I can go back and make changes if I need to. And on this copy, just call it texture 1. And I'm going to right click and tell it to rasterize the layer style. So that's going to make this go a little faster. It's going to get rid of that editable information and just make it an image file with this pattern. This will take a second. But now it's going to be a lot faster to use this than trying to use and manipulate the active pattern. The next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and lower my opacity so I can see my land behind there. I can see my topo lines. That's what I'm after. I'm going to do some transformations to this. So I'm going to do Control T. And the first thing I'm going to do is make it a little bit bigger so that I can do some warping and not run out of image. So making it a little bit bigger. And I'm going to right click and say warp. And I'm going to start pulling this. You can see, right, I'm just pulling it and kind of following my topo lines to approximate some curvature. So I'm going to squeeze this in at the top where it's a little farther from us. Lifting these handles here to start and kind of copy this pressure that we're seeing in the landscape. Right? So I can pull these edges down a little bit, flare these out. And this is much faster on this rasterized layer than trying to do this on the active pattern layer. It would be really slow because it's trying to recalculate the pattern each time. So I'm going to just kind of mimic this, get this a little close. Hit enter. The next thing I'm going to do is I want this to crop perfectly to my landscape and not be in the sky. So I'm going to hold Control and click on my ground layer. I'm just going to select those pixels perfectly, then click back to my texture 1 and mask it. I'm going to unlink this mask right away so I have the flexibility to adjust this layer behind here and not have it mess up my mask. I can move that around. I'm going to hide that temporarily, and I'm going to do the same process with the other texture. And I'm going to merge these together, kind of like we did with the sky background. So I'm going to do a new layer again. Control A. I'm going to fill it with white. Double click. I'm going to call this texture 1 right off the bat. Active pattern, or sorry, this is texture 2. I'm going to go to my pattern overlay, and this time I'm going to bring in the other one that I defined as a pattern. This is Alex's texture. I'm going to change the angle of this one. Maybe a little bit more flat. Let's say 0. I'll also lower the scale. That's a little tighter. Okay. Okay. I'm going to create a copy. This is going to be just texture 2, and then I'm going to rasterize it. All right, I'm turning off the active one. I'll lower the opacity. I'm going to think of this texture. Being more in the background. So I'm actually going to go ahead and invert the layer so it's a little bit darker than it currently is. I'm going to invert it. It's going to just make it a bit darker. flipping black and white there. Lower this a little bit more so I can see through it a little easier. I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to do Control T, make it a little bit bigger, and then start warping it to pull it. And I'm going to be thinking of this one as being in the background a little bit more. And then these two are going to merge together. So this is coming up into it a little bit. That's okay. You can always pull down a little bit too. I'm just trying, I want this to feel like it's receding from us. I'm really pinching that. Flaring along these edges. Right, you can kind of use your topo lines. I can kind of see the edge of that pattern line. I can see that curvature is kind of following these existing lines in here. Manipulating that. Really squeezing that. Okay. Say okay. Then I'm going to do the same thing where I mask it so it's only on the ground. I'm going to unlink that. I'm going to use that same gradient trick to blur these two together. But to do that, I'm going to have to make one more copy of this where it doesn't have anything hidden behind. So I'm going to do Control J to copy this layer. And on this one, I'm going to delete the layer mask. Invert the selection and actually delete those pixels above. And you'll see why in a second. I'm going to keep this one so that if I need to make changes, I can go back to it. I still have those pixels. The reason being is that now if I add a mask to this layer, I can do my gradient trick. And I'm going to have this texture, pen texture 2, blend into my foreground texture. So that's pretty cool actually. And you could play, right, you can play around with, maybe I want this one at a little bit of an angle. It's a little too much. All right, so you can play around with this gradient tool. I think that works a little bit better when it's a little bit softer like that. Another cool way to edit this gradient, let's say I want to bring back a little bit more of that background texture over here, and I'm going to up my opacity a little bit so we can see that background texture a little clearer. So we want that to feel a little bit darker back there. If I want a little bit more of that to wrap around this curve here, I can use my brush tool on a white color to bring some of that through. So I'm going to go to my brush, set my size fairly large. I'm going to really lower the opacity. So mine's at about 10 or 11 right now. And then I'm going to, on my mask layer, be sure you're on your mask layer, and my upper layer color is white here. If I draw now with this brush on this mask layer, it's going to start to it's going to adjust the edge of that gradient. I don't know if you can see that's starting to darken it there. I'm just kind of following my curve there, just to make that transition a little bit smoother. I can kind of keep going over that a little bit. Okay, so it's kind of blurring that line between there. Sorry, I'm just kind of softening that transition of the gradient a bit along that curve. All right. Cool. So now I can play around with these opacities a little bit. I could start to blend them a little bit. Maybe I want to look at these different blend modes. This is going to start, if I put these on multiply, it's going to bring through a little bit more of the ground shadows and textures behind the lines. And both of these are a little bit strong yet. I want to lower both. So we're seeing a little bit more of that original texture behind there. And so something like that's looking kind of nice. And now what's nice about how we've brought our house in is if I turn these layers back on, we can see that ground through there since we exported them as PNG. Right, we don't have to go in and cut out around them. I can tell when I make my house a little bit darker, lowering that opacity a bit. And the next thing to do here will be to bring in my sky. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to save this as a Photoshop file. Custom night sky. And I'm going to link the Photoshop file in. So any changes I make in here will automatically update in my final rendering here. I'm going to save this too. A06 render. Now I'm going to go to File, Place Linked, and link my custom night sky. That's going to bring it in behind everything. I can move it around in here. Maybe I want to move it up a little less moon, a little bit more horizon. And any changes I make in here, right? Let's say I move the moon, for example, and save that. When I go back to my render file, that should update. All right, so this is one way to start adding your pen textures to the ground. You could also export just a layer of your contour lines as a PNG if you want to bring those back in on top to make those lines a little darker. That's something else you could do. You could also make some copies of that ground plane and play around with adjusting the brightness and contrast of that to have it show through more. Since this is a night scene, maybe I want to darken that overall ground a little bit. And I may want to adjust the brightness and contrast of the whole file. I can do that with a layer adjustment. And if I adjust that here, it's going to adjust the brightness and contrast of all the layers below it. It's already looking a little bit sharper. All right, so those are the basic steps and some tips and tricks for adding your textures in Photoshop, using a gradient as a blending tool for masking and merging two layers into each other, and the process of creating your landscape and orienting your model in camera in Rhino. All right, guys, hope this was helpful, and let me know if you have any questions. All right.